The woman he saw, intimate, emphasizes recognition and being truly seen. The hook. She was the town's invisible shadow. Then one impossible decision changed everything. The rain hammered the small church in Millstone Valley like fists against glass. Inside, Sarah Morrow stood at the altar in her mother's worn wedding dress, watching the man she didn't love shift nervously beside her. Thomas Brennan was respectable, steady, safe, everything the town expected for a woman like her. A woman who cleaned houses, mended clothes, and had learned long ago that she was meant to disappear into the background of other people's lives. The priest began speaking words that felt like chains. Sarah's hands trembled. Not from nerves about marriage. She'd made peace with that months ago when her father died and the debts came due. Thomas had offered her a way out of poverty. The town had nodded approvingly. Her mother had cried with relief. Marriage was the bargain, and Sarah had accepted it without a single complaint. But as the priest asked if she took this man, something cracked open inside her chest. She saw her reflection in the polished mirror behind the altar, pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in someone else's fabric. She saw the life ahead. Children she might love, work she would never escape, a husband who was kind but had never once asked what she wanted. She would become like the furniture in his house. Present. Necessary. Invisible. The priest waited. The town waited. Her mother held her breath in the third pew. "I can't," Sarah whispered. The words came out so soft that only Thomas heard them. His face crumpled. He thought she was frightened. He reached for her hand gently, thinking comfort would steady her resolve. But Sarah pulled away and ran. She ran through the church, past shocked faces, past her mother's gasp, into the rain that broke open the sky. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of town, where the mountains rose up like walls, wild and untamed. She had no money, no plan, no place to go. The only thing she possessed was the terrible knowledge that she couldn't go back. The deeper problem. Mercy comes from the most unexpected place. That night, soaked and shaking, Sarah stumbled along the mountain pass. Thunder rolled across the peaks. The rain turned to sleet. Her bare feet, she'd abandoned her shoes somewhere in the chaos, were numb. She'd been walking for hours when she saw the cabin light glowing like a small gold coin in the darkness. She didn't remember approaching it. Didn't remember raising her fist to knock. A man opened the door. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and left in the sun too long. His eyes were dark and unreadable. He stared at her, this soaked, half-frozen woman in a wedding dress, without a flicker of judgment or curiosity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I need shelter. Just for tonight." He didn't ask her name or what she was running from. He simply pulled the door wider and stepped aside. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and leather. The fire was burning low. He moved to it wordlessly, adding wood while she dripped on his floor. He handed her a blanket and gestured to a wooden chair near the hearth. "Dry yourself," he said. His voice was rough and used. "There's hot water in the kettle." She watched him move around the small space, preparing soup, leaving folded clothes on the chair, sleeping on the floorboards near the door with his rifle close. He never asked her questions, never demanded explanations. He treated her like a frightened animal that might bolt if startled. By dawn, Sarah realized she didn't know his name. And more terrifying, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. The complication. The world has other plans. The next morning, a knock shattered the fragile peace. 3 men stood outside the cabin. They wore the badge of the territorial law, but something about them felt corrupt, hungry. The one in front had a scar down his left cheek and eyes like ice. "We're looking for a woman," the scarred man said. His gaze found Sarah through the window, and something cold twisted in her chest. Sarah Morrow. Left town yesterday. Broken contract. Her fiancé's filing charges, abandonment, fraud, breach of marriage agreement. There's a bounty on her head. Sarah's breath stopped. A bounty. Thomas had actually put a bounty on her. The man with the dark eyes, she still didn't know his name, stood in the doorway blocking the sun. He looked at the lawman with an expression that suggested he was measuring them and finding them wanting. "Haven't seen anyone," he said flatly. The scarred man smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. Well, Jake Garrett, that's interesting. Because we've got a report from the town saying she was seen heading this direction. Pretty fancy dress, all torn up. Wedding dress, if you believe it. He stepped closer. You wouldn't be harboring a fugitive, would you? Jake, his name was Jake. It hit Sarah like a stone. Check the cabin if you want, Jake said. His hand rested casually on his rifle. But if you come inside, you come with your guns holstered and your manners intact. The scarred man's jaw tightened. For a moment, the world hung suspended between violence and standoff. Then slowly the men backed away. The scarred man pointed a finger at Jake. We'll be back. With official papers. And if we find out you're lying. He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. When they rode away, Jake closed the door and locked it. He looked at Sarah with those unreadable eyes. You need to tell me what this is really about, he said quietly. Because men like that don't stop. And I need to know if I'm helping a woman escape injustice, or if I'm protecting someone who did something that deserves punishment. Sarah's hands trembled. This was her moment to disappear, to let herself be taken back to a life that would slowly erase her, or to trust a stranger with the truth. She took a breath and began to speak. And as the words came out, about her father's death, the debt, Thomas's ultimatum, the wedding that felt like drowning, she saw something shift in Jake's face. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. My mother was promised to a man once, Jake said quietly. She was so quiet about her fear that no one noticed. By the time anyone did, she was already gone. Died in childbirth at 17. He looked away. I've spent my whole life thinking the world didn't have room for quiet women who needed to survive. The cliffhanger. Help comes with a dangerous price. Jake walked to a wooden chest and pulled out papers and money. You can ride to the next territory. Change your name. Start over. He pressed the envelope into her hands. Go tonight. Before those men come back. Sarah's throat tightened. He was giving her freedom. A second chance. Everything she'd been too afraid to take for herself. But as she moved toward the saddlebags he was preparing, there was another sound, horses, but many more this time. Sarah rushed to the window and her blood froze. It wasn't the law. It was worse. The men riding toward the cabin wore the marks of Thomas Brennan's family. His brothers, his hired men. At least 15 of them. And Thomas himself was at the front, his face twisted with something darker than anger. He held a rope coiled in his hands. Jake saw them too. He moved Sarah away from the window and stepped outside onto the porch, his silhouette filling the doorway. Thomas's voice carried across the distance, cold and cruel. Send her out, Garrett. Or we burn the cabin with both of you inside. Jake didn't move. He didn't flinch. But Sarah watched from the shadows inside, understanding suddenly that the man who had saved her was now standing on the edge of a cliff. And she had pushed him there. The real question wasn't whether Jake would protect her. It was whether she would let him die trying. The price of choosing. The hook. She never knew quiet women could be warriors. Until she had no choice but to become one. Sarah moved faster than thought. She grabbed the rifle Jake had left inside, checked that it was loaded, and positioned herself at the cabin's side window. Her hand steadied. Her fear didn't disappear, but it became something else, purpose, pure and clean. Outside, Thomas was still talking, still confident. He didn't know that the woman he'd publicly humiliated was now standing with a loaded gun in her hands. He thought she was cowering inside, helpless, waiting to be dragged back to the life he'd chosen for her. Jake turned slightly, as if sensing her movement. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. She saw surprise there. Then something that looked like respect. She's not property, Jake said, loud enough for all of them to hear. She made a choice. You don't get to undo that by rope or fire. Thomas laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed across the mountain. That woman owes me a marriage contract. My family owes her a lesson. And you, Garrett, you're about to learn what happens when you steal what belongs to a Brennan. The first gunshot came from Jake's rifle. He fired into the ground in front of the lead horses, and the animals reared, scattering. It was a warning shot, not an attack. But it changed everything. Chaos exploded. Bullets tore into the cabin walls. Jake dragged the water trough in front of the porch and used it as cover, returning fire with the precision of someone who'd spent his life in hard country. Sarah watched as 3 of Thomas's men fell. Not killed, wounded, but enough to make the others hesitate. But Thomas wasn't hesitating. He was shouting orders, repositioning his men, trying to circle the cabin. He had numbers. He had rage. He had the advantage of not caring who got hurt, as long as Sarah was retrieved or destroyed. Sarah fired through the window. She'd never held a gun before in her life. She'd never imagined herself capable of it. But she didn't aim to kill. She aimed to protect. Her shot went wide of Thomas's horse, but it was enough to make him aware she was armed. She saw his face change, the shock that the quiet, invisible woman was fighting back. "Get out of there!" he screamed at his men. "Burn it! Burn it down!" Someone threw a torch at the cabin's roof. Caught. The deepening crisis. Survival requires more than courage. Smoke began pouring through the wooden beams. Jake was still on the porch, still fighting, but he was 1 man against 15, and the fire was spreading faster than anger. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was going to stay and hold them off while she escaped. She wouldn't allow it. Sarah grabbed a shovel from the corner of the cabin and began throwing dirt on the fire spreading across the roof, standing on a beam despite the smoke and heat. The fire was eating the wood too fast. It wasn't going to work. But then something unexpected happened. A group of riders crested the hill, 10, maybe 12 of them. Sarah recognized the brand on their horses. It was the neighboring ranch. Word must have spread about the shooting. The riders descended on Thomas's men like an avalanche. Jake had friends. Or perhaps more likely, there were people in the territory who hated Thomas Brennan enough to fight him when opportunity arose. The battle shifted. Thomas's force was suddenly outnumbered. He screamed orders, but his men were already losing. Some tried to ride away. Others dropped their weapons and surrendered. In the chaos, Thomas made a choice that would echo through the rest of their lives. He rode directly at the cabin, straight toward the front door where Jake stood reloading. Sarah watched from inside as Thomas drew his gun, not to shoot but to execute a different kind of violence. He was going to run Jake down, trample him, make the killing personal. Sarah didn't think. She moved. She grabbed the rope Jake had shown her, the rope meant for escape coiled by the window. She looped it around the cabin's support beam and swung out the window, the rope in her hands, just as Thomas's horse charged forward. The rope caught Thomas across the chest. It sent him flying backward off his horse, and he hit the ground hard enough that Sarah heard his breath leave his body. He lay there, gasping, unable to move, his face twisted in fury and disbelief that this woman had brought him down. The reckoning. Understanding the cost. When the smoke cleared, the cabin was damaged but still standing. Thomas was alive but broken. His arm bent at an angle that suggested permanent injury, his pride destroyed beyond repair. His men surrendered without argument. The neighboring ranchers, led by a woman named Catherine Voss, who owned more land than anyone in the territory, surveyed the damage with grim satisfaction. "That's for stealing my water rights 5 years ago," Catherine said to Thomas, spitting on the ground near him. "And this is for being a coward who fights women." Catherine turned to Jake and Sarah. "You two need medical attention and shelter. My ranch is 6 miles south. Come on." The emotional turning point. What happens when the world finally sees you? At Catherine's ranch, a sprawling, impressive compound that rivaled any estate Sarah had ever imagined, Jake received treatment for a wound in his shoulder that Sarah hadn't even noticed he'd received. The doctor from town came and worked carefully, and while Jake was being bandaged, Sarah sat in Catherine's kitchen, still wearing pieces of her wedding dress. Catherine was a woman in her 40s, strong-shouldered, with silver streaking her dark hair. She poured Sarah coffee and watched her with knowing eyes. "You're the girl who left Thomas Brennan at the altar," Catherine said. Not a question. Sarah nodded, waiting for judgment. "I heard 3 versions of that story already. In one, you're a hysterical woman who panicked. In another, you're a faithless bride who destroyed an innocent man. In the third, which I suspect is closest to truth, you simply decided you weren't willing to disappear." Catherine smiled. "I've spent my whole life in those mountains. I know what happens to quiet women. They either learn to be loud or they learn to be invisible. You chose differently. I destroyed a man's reputation, Sarah said quietly. No, Catherine said sharply. He destroyed his own by showing everyone what kind of man he truly is. The fact that it took you walking away for people to see it, that's not your fault. Catherine stood and looked out the window toward where the ranch hands were bringing in cattle. Jake Garrett is a good man. Different kind of man. The kind who doesn't need a woman to be helpless to feel like he's worth something. Just thought you should know. The cliffhanger. The choice becomes even more complicated. 3 days later, Sarah found Jake on the porch of Catherine's main house, his arm in a sling looking out toward the mountains. She still hadn't told him everything. Hadn't told him that her father had left her something before he died. Something she'd been too afraid to claim. Catherine told me about your father, Jake said without turning around. Told me he owned land. Meadowland. That you inherited it but never registered the papers because Thomas was going to marry you and claim it as part of the union. Sarah's heart stopped. The land? Yes. 50 acres of good grazing land, north of the valley, that could be worth something if developed properly. Worth enough to matter. Worth enough to make a woman independent. Why would she tell you that? Sarah asked carefully. Jake turned to face her, and in his eyes was something that looked like fear mixed with hope. Because she said a woman who swings from a rope to stop a man like Thomas Brennan deserves to know her own power. And because... He paused. Because I'm leaving tomorrow. Heading back to my cabin. Alone. The way I've always been. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. Why are you telling me this? She asked, though she already knew. Because you deserve choices, Jake said quietly. Real ones. Not made out of desperation or fear. You can take Catherine's offer. She'll help you develop that land, make you part of her operation. You can go to the city with the money she'd give you. You can start any kind of life you want. A life where quiet doesn't mean invisible. He stepped closer. Or you can do something I don't deserve to ask. What? Sarah whispered. Come with me to that cabin in the mountains. Help me rebuild it. Let me know you every single day for the rest of my life. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to. Even though it's hard. Even though it's uncertain. Sarah's breath caught. This was the impossible choice. This was the moment that would define everything. I need to think, she said. I know, Jake replied. Take as long as you need. But I'm leaving at sunrise. That night, Sarah stood alone in the guest room, holding her father's deed to the land, paper-thin, precious proof that she had always owned something of her own. She looked at the woman in the mirror. Not invisible anymore. Not bound anymore. But standing at the edge of a new kind of choice. She could leave with the dawn. Just not with Jake. Or she could risk everything on a man and a cabin and the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah heard horses being prepared outside. Jake was getting ready to leave. The woman who chose herself. The hook. She had everything she needed to disappear. But she chose to stand, right beside the only man who ever saw her. Sarah dressed in the dark. She put on the sturdy clothes Catherine had given her. Pants, a proper shirt, boots that fit. She left her mother's wedding dress folded on the bed, a symbol of the life she was leaving. Then she took her father's deed and rolled it carefully, placing it in her pack alongside the few things she owned. The world was still black when she stepped outside. Jake was at the stable, saddling his horse. His arm was still in a sling, and she could see the pain in how carefully he moved, but he didn't slow down. When he saw her, he stopped completely. His hands went still on the saddle. You're coming, he said. Not a question. But she heard the hope in it barely contained. On one condition, Sarah said, and she saw something flicker across his face. The understanding that conditions meant she was thinking clearly, being fair to herself. The land my father left me. We develop it together. It's not just your cabin. It's our future. Built on something that's already mine. Jake's face creased into something that looked like relief mixed with profound respect. That's more than fair, he said. That's perfect. The first real challenge. The world doesn't change easily. They rode for 2 days through the mountains, taking the high pass to avoid the valley where Thomas Brennan still lay recovering, where her mother still waited, hoping she'd come to her senses. They rode in companionable silence, stopping only to water the horses and eat cold food. On the third morning they reached the land. Sarah's land. It stretched before them like a promise, meadowland wild and beautiful, bordered by a clear stream that would be perfect for irrigation. There was a stand of pine trees on the north ridge and flat grazing land toward the south. It was everything her father had described to her on his deathbed, before the fever took him away. Jake dismounted slowly, still managing his injured arm with careful grace. He walked the perimeter while Sarah simply stood in the middle of the meadow and cried. Not sad tears. Tears of recognition. This land had belonged to her all along. She'd just been too afraid to claim it. But their peace was short-lived. That evening, as they were setting up a temporary camp, riders appeared on the ridge. Sarah's heart dropped, but as they drew closer, she recognized Catherine Voss leading them. With Catherine were the territorial marshal and two men in official-looking coats. Sarah's stomach twisted. The bounty. Thomas must have escalated it. Catherine dismounted and walked directly to Sarah, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Don't be afraid, Catherine whispered. I brought witnesses. The territorial marshal stepped forward, a man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much injustice. Miss Morrow, the marshal said formally, I'm here about the charges filed against you. Turns out, in reviewing the territorial marriage law, we discovered something interesting. A woman cannot be charged with breach of contract for refusing a marriage before it's legally completed. And more than that. He gestured to the two men in official coats. These gentlemen are lawyers from the territorial capital. They were reviewing marriage contracts across the region for a different case and found some irregularities in Thomas Brennan's paperwork. The lawyers stepped forward. The first one spoke quietly but with absolute authority. Thomas Brennan forged his father's name on a loan agreement to pay your family's debts, Miss Morrow. The debt was never legitimate. More than that, he had altered the marriage contract to include a clause that would have allowed him to claim your inherited land. That's fraud. Multiple counts. The case against you is dismissed. More than that, you have grounds to file charges against him. Sarah felt the earth shift beneath her in a different way now. All those years she'd thought she owed Thomas something. And the whole time he'd been stealing from her. The transformation. Quiet women who become unstoppable. The marshal didn't stay long. He left copies of the dismissed charges and the documentation of Thomas's fraud. Catherine stayed longer, helping Sarah and Jake sketch out plans for developing the land. Before she left, Catherine pulled Sarah aside. Thomas will spend the next years dealing with criminal charges and civil suits, Catherine said. His family's already distancing themselves from him. He did that. Not you. You did one thing, you chose not to disappear. Everything else followed from that. Catherine smiled and rode back toward her ranch. The resolution. Building a life that's truly chosen. The cabin that Jake had built sat on the edge of Sarah's inherited land. It was small, weathered, perfect. Together they began the work of making it into something more, not just shelter but home. Spring came to the mountains and with it the true labor. Jake taught Sarah how to manage the irrigation from the stream. She taught him how to keep ledgers and plan the long-term development of the land. They worked in the sunshine and in the rain, and slowly the meadow began to change. Fences went up. A larger cabin was built, with Catherine's help and that of half a dozen hands Jake hired from the neighboring ranches. Summer arrived with a harvest that promised prosperity. Sarah stood in the middle of her own land one evening, Jake beside her, watching the sun paint the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her father's deed was now recorded officially in the territorial registry. The land was legally, undeniably hers. And she'd chosen to share it not because she had to, but because Jake had shown her what it meant to be truly seen. I have something for you, Sarah said, pulling out a piece of paper. It was a deed of partnership. She and Jake together, their names joined on the land, equal partners in everything built here. Jake looked at it for a long moment, then at her face. She saw something break open in him, years of being solitary, of believing a man like him didn't deserve to be chosen, finally understanding that he had been. I don't know how to do this, Jake said quietly. I don't know how to be part of something. Part of someone. Neither did I, Sarah said. But you taught me. By never asking me to be anything except what I was. By protecting me not because you thought I was weak, but because you believed I was worth protecting. She smiled. I'll teach you how to let yourself be loved. The true ending. The unfolding of a different kind of story. That autumn, as the aspens turned gold and the first snow touched the mountain peaks, Sarah and Jake stood together on the porch of their cabin and received visitors. Catherine came with a proposition. Let her help fund a larger operation, and they could become one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Sarah's mother came tentatively and wept when she saw her daughter happy, truly happy, with dirt under her fingernails and ownership in her name. Thomas Brennan was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His family's empire cracked under the weight of legal battles. Sarah could have felt satisfaction in that, but mostly she felt relief. The life she'd escaped had truly ended. There was no looking back. One night, as snow fell softly outside their cabin, Jake held Sarah close beside the fire. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Running from Thomas? Coming here? Taking a chance on a broken mountain man? Sarah turned in his arms to look at him. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that even now, she might disappear the way everything good had disappeared from his life before. Every single day, she said, watching his expression crumple slightly. Then she smiled. I regret it because it means I made the hardest choice of my life, and there's no way to know if I'd have the courage to make it again. But I regret it the way a person regrets jumping off a cliff into dark water. Thrilled and terrified and completely alive. Jake kissed her forehead, then her temple, then her mouth. It was gentle and deep and absolute. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the meadowland that belonged to a woman the world had once thought invisible. Inside, the fire crackled softly, warming two people who had both learned that quiet didn't mean powerless, that overlooked didn't mean worthless, that the most important moments in a life often come when you finally choose yourself. Epilogue. 1 year later. The spring following, Sarah stood at the window of their expanded cabin, watching Jake work with the new hands, training them on her system of land management. She was 18 weeks pregnant, and though Jake was nervous about everything, Sarah had never been more certain about anything in her life. She'd already registered her unborn child's inheritance, not just the land, but the story of how a woman who was nearly invisible learned to see herself, and a man who believed he was meant to be alone learned what it meant to be chosen. When Jake came inside that evening, Sarah guided his hand to her belly, and he felt the flutter of life, of possibility, of a future that was entirely theirs. A boy or girl? He asked softly. Doesn't matter, Sarah said. Either way, they'll know the truth. That quiet women can be warriors. That broken men can be whole. That the most powerful love story ever written is the one where the overlooked woman stops disappearing and chooses to shine. Jake pulled her close and Sarah rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady, reliable, hers. The mountain wind sang outside. The fire crackled within. And in the cabin on the edge of the meadowland, a woman who had once thought herself invisible finally understood what it meant to be absolutely, undeniably seen.